The Voice of America, which, along with the BBC World Service and Radio France International, is one of the most respected international broadcasters in the world. Just as other broadcasters, the VOA is also going through some changes. These include the reduction of HF frequencies and looking at new platforms to remain competitive. Now, they're not leaving shortwave, they're only redefining what platform is best to serve their audiences. So in areas where traditional radio plays an important role, shortwave will continue. But in areas where internet and mobile technology are penetrating the market, they are changing their strategy. But what about censorship from local governments? Countries like China, Iran, Syria, and others can and do switch off access to content from providers that they see as a threat to their regimes. It's a fine balance. Mathew, the Internet Managing Editor of the VOA, talks about these challenges facing U.S. international broadcasting.
A tense situation in a French city. UN support for one effort to end the violence in Syria. The U.S. suspends efforts to recover the remains of service members missing in North Korea. I'm Ira Melman reporting from Washington. French news.
One of the areas that I've seen a lot of development in is, for example, mobile phone technology. In Africa, many countries now, to install landlines would be very expensive and near impossible, but mobile phones are taking off. Is this one area of growth that you're seeing, for example, like with some broadcasters like the BBC? The BBC phone app is extremely popular in those countries. Kenya, even Zimbabwe, where it's heavily censored sometimes and doesn't even work. The phone apps work.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that mobile, not just that they've sort of leapfrogged technology where they didn't really ever have landlines in the first place, but I think you have to extend that to how people interact with digital technology. That also means that many people in our audience, in our target audiences, they never sit down in front of a desktop. We think about the Internet as I'm going to sit down in front of my computer and I'm going to go visit a website. There are huge chunks of the world now who, other than Internet cafes or at work, they've never had that experience. Their sole experience with the Internet is on phones. Now, the technology in a lot of countries is still behind. Think about the old flip phones that we were using 5 or 6 years ago. They're WAP, that's Wireless Application Protocol. A lot of countries still use those types of phones. But we have seen an exponential growth in smartphones in a lot of countries in just the last probably 8 to 12 months, particularly with Android, iPhone in some parts of the world. But I think we have to think about that as an audience segment that is as different from desktop internet as desktop internet is different from broadcast. They have different readership patterns. They're interested in different things. They come in at different times of the day. And I think that a lot of outlets, not just in international broadcasting, but commercially, are still trying to figure that out. They're not quite sure. Do you come up with a really separate product for the mobile piece of it, or do you simply copy what you're doing for desktop?
What about censorship? We see this as a problem in many countries. China, for one, has the Great Firewall of China, where they block off a number of websites, not just the VOA, Radio Free Asia, BBC Chinese, Deutsche Welle Chinese. There's a very long list. I've heard that the VOA, as well as the BBG, is working on a technology so people in China will be able to access this information. I mean, right now, you said that China is one of the number one markets. How do people access if the websites are being blocked?
Well, in English, we're not being blocked. About 17 or 18 months ago, they lifted blocks on the BBC, on the Voice of America, on dozens of commercial websites. Nobody quite knows why. The wall simply dropped one day.
Now, for English?
For English. Now, that's not the case for Mandarin. We are still blocked in Mandarin. But in terms of circumvention, there's a certain sort of cat and mouse that goes on in the engineering department around this where there really is no way to stop countries from blocking us. The best thing that we can do is provide a suite of tools that allows people to get around the firewall, and not just to come to us, but to come to anyone that they want. So part of that is handing out proxy information. So you go through servers that allow you to route around the firewall. It can be as low-tech as something that's nicknamed SneakerNet. So SneakerNet is where somebody sneaks a USB stick into a country and starts passing around the information on it, and it never really gets onto the internet. There are protocols like the Tor network and the Onion network, which are sort of anonymization tools. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds technically here, but the idea is you throw a lot of things at the wall, a few of them stick, and you have to constantly readjust your strategy.
Mm-hmm. So it's almost like in the old days of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, put more frequencies on the air, maybe change a couple of frequencies every now and again, put more frequencies on the air. Eventually you may have 10, 2 of them may get through or whatever.
Exactly, and you're constantly readjusting what your strategy is. Now, I'm on the news side of things, so I don't deal directly with that technology. That's handled by an engineering office here. But I think it's something that hasn't been figured out yet, and it's a lot more challenging than simply saying, here are some proxy servers. I mean, if you look at Google's efforts to get into China about 2 years ago, they basically gave up. They went in and tried to conquer the search engine market there. They were up against a domestic competitor. China, incidentally, has a really interesting market when it comes to blocking. Because rather than like a lot of countries like Iran, for instance, where they simply say, no, you're not allowed to use Facebook, no, you're not allowed to use Twitter, you're not allowed to do all on and on down the list, what China has done is to block sites like Facebook and Twitter, but then to say, now here's a domestic version of it. Here's Weibo instead of Twitter. So we have our own microblogging service. Don't use Western multiplayer games. We'll have Chinese-made games that you can use. And by the way, we're going to monitor all of these, and we own these. These are state concerns. So it's harder to get people to leave something that they already have that's a simulacrum of what U.S. companies are trying to put out, and that's what Google discovered. So when they went into that market and they tried to get a footprint as a search engine there, they ultimately pulled out. They failed. Because they couldn't really penetrate into the market, and then the Chinese government started causing serious problems for their operation. They may have even hacked into some of Google's systems to try to prevent them from making a footprint there. So they packed up and went home. So it's very, very challenging in some of these countries.
This is the Voice of America transmitter at Greenville, North Carolina.
This is the Voice of America. From Washington, we bring you...
The VOA now is 70 years old. There's been a lot of changes along the way. What do you think, I mean, from what we've been talking about, the future of VOAs, do you think in 70 years from now, everybody will be connected to the Internet? Hopefully everybody will be connected to the Internet. Is that the way that it's going, or do you still see a time when there will be the more traditional forms of distribution?
I think there still will be some kind of traditional distribution. I mean, I've done digital media for 15 years now. I've just been working for VOA for 2 years. I came out of commercial media. I eat, breathe, and live this stuff. I still watch television. I still listen to the radio. I still read books. I think there will probably be a market for traditional broadcast products. I doubt it's going to be shortwave 70 years from now. I very seriously doubt that. What you may see is delivery over IP. So you may see high-quality, well-produced television and radio programs that are delivered over Internet protocol. So instead of going out through these incredibly expensive broadcast towers, the same kind of programming, but it's sent out with more cost-effective means. If you look back 5 or 10 years ago, there was sort of this panic by the recording industry and the motion picture industry that the advent of delivery over IP was going to mean the death knell of professionally produced music or films coming out of Hollywood or out of other film centers around the world. It didn't mean that. Now, in the beginning, there was a panic. You had sites like Napster that came around and thought, oh my God, everything's going to become free. Our model's going to collapse. Now it's a huge moneymaker, things like iTunes, where people can go in and purchase music directly through a storefront like that. And you talked about services that offer movies over IP. So that industry didn't go away. It just had to adapt. And that's what media has to do, including international broadcasters, is we have to make smart decisions about how are people consuming media now, how do we reach them in ways that we know they're consuming this stuff, rather than being wedded to sort of the old ways of doing things. You think back to the people in the 1940s who sort of were the pioneers of international broadcasting, I guess the 30s, 40s, and 50s. they didn't think, well, we have to figure out how to put newspapers out around the world. They took an emerging technology, they hired really smart people, and they said, we're going to figure out how to make this work. We're going to use a technology that people are embracing now, and that's why they succeeded. So that's our challenge, is to do the exact same thing and try to make sure that we have a solid future going forward.
With the VOA's numerous websites in various different languages, what are they mostly accessing? Text, video, audio, or is it a combination of all three, or is there one that's, say, more popular than the others?
This may be surprising, but text is still king on the internet. Part of that is because search engines scan text. They don't scan pictures or video quite as well.
Well, not yet anyway.
Not yet. But also, if you think about this, how quickly you can parse information when you're reading. So if you have an article and you want to get the gist of it, think about the structure of how an article is put together in print style. It's the inverted pyramids. You start with the broadest information, and then you begin to narrow down. You can very quickly, and you can skim, you can skip, you can figure out the little pieces you want very quickly in 10 or 15 seconds, get the gist of an article. It's harder to do that with audio and video. You have to grab the scrubber, and you have to kind of jump along and try to sort of get the gist of the story that way. And because a lot of broadcast, what makes for good radio, what makes for good television, means that it's a different structure. And so you don't always get the information up front. Sometimes you have to kind of hunt around for it a little bit. So I think that for people who, A, are time-starved, which seems to be everybody these days, and B, for people who are paying for metered bandwidth or by the minute for internet, they still seem to gravitate towards text and photos. It's lower bandwidth, doesn't cost as much to push through. If you have a poor connection, you can get it a lot faster, and the information is easier to ingest. Now, all that said, there are cases of where audio, you can, especially if you have really good natural sound, it tells the story in a way that text can't, and video is obviously that times 10. I mean, sometimes there are stories that 10 seconds of video will give you the equivalent of a 5,000-word story. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to come up with, again, every story deserves its own treatment.
That's fast, any way you look at it. Thanks for joining us here on The Voice of America. Our program went by quickly as well. This has been International Edition. You can find us anytime on the internet at voanews.com. We hope you'll stay tuned. The latest world news is coming up shortly. For our director, Brenda Floyd. Sorry, Brenda, I'm stuttering around. Our engineer, Jesse Brooks, and John Ellison. I'm Steve Norman, trying to speak here in Washington. You guys have a great Thursday.
Keith was speaking with Mathew Bays, the Internet Managing Editor.